The sun was a dying ember behind the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It cast long, bleeding shadows across the porch of my father's cabin. The air carried the sharp, nostalgic scent of drying maple leaves. Ghostly hickory smoke drifted from a neighbor's hearth miles away. I sat on the edge of the weathered timber. My boots were coated in the thick, red clay of Virginia. The wood of the porch creaked under my weight. It was a familiar moan, sounding like an old friend's greeting. I was watching the twilight swallow the valley when she appeared. Elena came up the dirt path with a steady, rhythmic gait. She refused to acknowledge the exhaustion of the long day. She stopped at the bottom step, silhouetted against the bruised purple of the horizon. She didn't ask to come up. She didn't offer a single word of greeting. She simply stood there, her presence pulling the very air out of my lungs. Her dress was a faded calico, worn thin at the elbows. It was stained with the honest, stubborn grime of the fields. Her hair was escaping its pins, catching the last stray rays of gold. It looked like a halo made of copper wire. But it was her hands that truly held my gaze. They were resting at her sides, palms slightly turned out. They were calloused and mapped with small, white scars. These were the marks of years wrestling a living out of the stubborn earth. They were the hands of a woman who knew the weight of a heavy plow. She understood the silent, frustrating stubbornness of a mule. She looked at me, and her eyes were two lanterns burning in the gathering dark. There was no softness in them. I saw only a terrifying, brittle strength. It was the look of someone who had prepared herself for a blow. She was tired of waiting for it to land. "I went to the Grange social in town today," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and devoid of any music. She didn't use the light tones most women used to bridge a silence. I remained still, my hands resting heavily on my knees. "The music was loud enough to hear from the road," I replied quietly. She didn't smile, she didn't even blink. "I stood by the punch bowl for 3 hours," she continued. "I wore my mother's best lace collar, the one from before the war. I didn't miss a single dance because I was never asked to join one." Shaw took a step closer, the light from the window hitting the side of her face. I saw the slight tremor in her jaw. It was the only crack in her stone-cold armor. "Every man in this town has refused my hand, Thomas," she stated. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I couldn't. I had been to every church supper, every harvest dance, every town gathering. Not once had I seen a man ask Elena for a single dance. She wasn't exaggerating. She was telling me the saddest truth in the valley. She said it as if she were reading a ledger of cold, hard debts. From the baker's son to the sheriff's deputy, they see me coming and they find a sudden interest in the weather. They turn to their horses as if they are the only kin they have left. They have made it quite clear that I am a ghost walking among the living. She looked at me then, searching for a flicker of pity or fear. She expected me to look away, just like the others. She expected me to offer a hollow comfort about the right time. She expected a sermon about God's will for the lonely. The silence stretched between us, heavy as a thick winter quilt. I looked at her hands again, seeing the history of survival written there. I thought of the men she mentioned, the ones with soft palms and loud voices. They were men who wanted porcelain dolls to sit on their mantles. They feared a woman who could survive a drought without weeping. They didn't understand that a woman's strength was the only thing keeping these mountains from crumbling. I stood up slowly, the old floorboards screaming under my feet. I walked to the edge of the porch until I was looking down at her. The mountain wind kicked up, tossing a handful of dry leaves across the steps. I reached out, not to touch her, but to acknowledge the space she occupied. "Then every man in this town is a fool. Elena," I said. She didn't cry. That frightened me more than tears ever could. A woman only stops crying after the world has disappointed her too many times. My voice was like the stones in the creek, hard, grounded, and certain. They are looking for reflections of themselves in a mirror. They aren't looking for a partner to build a life against the wind. I saw her eyes widen just a tiny fraction. The brittle strength didn't break, but it shifted. For the first time, she looked like she might actually breathe. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I have never wasted a word on a lie in my life," I replied. I saw the hurt then, the raw truth of it. It wasn't a fresh wound. It was a deep, old ache hidden behind her ribs. It was the exhaustion of being a lonely island in a sea of whispers. She had spent so long being the town's tragedy. She had forgotten how it felt to simply be a woman. A fool sees a diamond in the dirt and complains about the mud, I told her. A wise man thanks the earth for keeping it safe until he arrived. The shadows had fully claimed the yard now. Her eyes remained bright, reflecting the rising moon. She gripped the railing of the porch, her knuckles turning white. I could feel the heat of her indignation. The cold of her loneliness was warring in the air between us. She wasn't just a woman looking for a husband to pay the taxes. She was a soul looking for a witness to her existence. She wanted someone to say that her struggle actually mattered. She wanted someone to see the grit beneath the calico and call it beautiful. I stayed there, standing in the doorway of my own life, watching her. I realized then that my porch had been empty for far too long. The mountains seemed to lean in, listening to the quiet gravity of the moment. This wasn't a romance from a cheap dime novel. This was two tired people finding a place to rest their spirits. This was the beginning of a long, hard road. For the first time since the war ended, I didn't want to walk it alone. I watched her chin lift, that stubborn pride returning to its rightful place. She wasn't defeated. She was just waiting for the world to catch up to her value. If you want to walk beside me through these memories, please join our family. Let us journey together back to the Blue Ridge. Kindness was the only currency that truly mattered in those hills. The town of Ellensburg did not bury its secrets in the dirt. It wore them like a badge of misplaced righteousness. I stood in the shadows of Miller's General Store the next morning. The air was thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and salted pork. Dust motes danced in the shafts of autumn light. It cut through the thick grime of the front windows. It was a Tuesday, the day the valley women gathered to trade gossip. The floorboards groaned under the weight of heavy flour sacks. I heard the rhythmic thud of the shopkeeper's heavy brass stamp. The bell above the door chimed, a sharp, silver note. It usually signaled a neighbor's arrival and a friendly nod. But as Elena stepped over the threshold, the world inside went unnervingly still. The lively chatter of the Miller sisters died in their throats. Mrs. Higgins pulled her daughter closer, as if Elena carried a plague. The silence wasn't polite, it was a physical weight. Elena didn't flinch, even as the eyes of the town bored into her back. She walked to the counter with her head held high. She placed a small basket of eggs on the scarred wood. Mr. Miller didn't look her in the eye. He reached for the ledger, his movement stiff and resentful. This was the cost of her courage, the price of the justice she had sought. Several years after the Great Blizzard, a financial panic swept through the region. The banks came for the widow's land. Elena stood against them when almost no one else would. They wanted the valley land for the new railroad expansion. While the men of the town looked at their boots, Elena stood at the courthouse steps. She had used her father's old legal books to find the flaws in the foreclosures. She saved 6 farms, but she had embarrassed the powerful men who owned the debt. They couldn't forgive a woman for being smarter than their greed. They couldn't forgive her for seeing the truth they wanted to hide. In this town, dignity was often sacrificed for a quiet life. But Elena chose the storm over the silence of a lie. I stepped out of the shadows, the spurs on my boots jingling. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet store. I walked straight to her side and rested my hand on the counter. "Good morning, Miss Elena," I said, my voice carrying to the back of the room. The Miller sisters gasped, their fans freezing mid-air. I turned to the shopkeeper, staring him down until he finally looked up. "I believe these eggs are worth more than the credit you're giving," I stated. My voice was calm, but it held the edge of a sharpened blade. I saw the color drain from Mr. Miller's face. He knew my history, the things I had seen on the battlefields of the wilderness. He knew I didn't fear the judgment of a small town. Elena looked at me, and for the first time I saw a tear threaten to fall. It wasn't a tear of weakness. It was the overflow of a heart that had been thirsty for an ally. She didn't need a savior, but she deserved a witness. I reached out and took her hand, the one with the scars. I squeezed it gently, letting the warmth of my palm meet her cold skin. In that moment, The gossip of the Miller sisters didn't matter. The judgment of the sheriff's deputy was nothing but wind in the trees. We were two souls who understood that honor is a lonely path. It is a path that requires more than just words. It requires the willingness to stand in the fire with another. "Let's go, Elena," I said softly. We walked out of the store together, the bell chiming behind us. The sun was bright, hitting the dusty street with an uncompromising glare. The town watched from the windows, whispering behind lace curtains. They saw a man and a woman who refused to be broken. They saw the beginning of a different kind of strength. Justice wasn't something found in a courtroom in these hills. It was something you built with your own two hands. It was something you defended on a creaky porch at sunset. As we walked toward the mountains, I felt the weight of her hand in mine. It was the heaviest and lightest thing I had ever carried. She was a woman of the earth, and I was a man of the shadows. Together, we were a storm that the valley wasn't prepared for. We climbed the path back to the cabin, the air getting cooler. The smell of pine needles was sharp and clean. Life in the Blue Ridge was never easy. It was a constant struggle against the weather and the ghosts of the past. But as long as there was one person to see your truth, it was enough. It was more than enough. We reached the porch and sat down, watching the valley turn to gold. The world was vast and often cruel. But here, in the shadow of the peaks, we found a small piece of justice. We found a dignity that didn't require the permission of the town. We found a love that was as rugged and enduring as the stone beneath us. This was our home, and we would defend it with everything we had. The wind whispered through the maple leaves, telling stories of old. I listened to the silence, and for the first time, it didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. It felt like the truth. Elena rested her head on my shoulder, her breathing steady and deep. The long day was over, and the night was ours to keep. We would face the morning together, come what may, for in the heart of Virginia, love was the only thing that survived the fire. It was the only thing that could turn a ghost back into a woman. And it was the only thing that could make a soldier feel whole again. The mountains stood watch, eternal and unmoving. They had seen it all before, and they would see it all again. But they had never seen a pair quite like us. We were the fire in the dark, we were the hope in the hollow, and we were finally white. Truly, Diane. The town's judgment hung in the winter air like a heavy, invisible shroud. Every window we passed was a cold, glass eye watching our transgression. I felt the weight of their silence pressing against my ribs. It was the sound of doors locking and hearts hardening. The sentence of the valley had been passed without a single word spoken in court. We were the outcasts, the two souls who dared to walk in the light of day. But as the first pines of the mountain slope gathered us in, the pressure began to lift. The air here didn't taste of rumors or stale grudges. It tasted of resin, damp earth, and a wild, terrifying freedom. I realized then that a sentence only has power if you recognize the authority of the judge. In the vast, indifferent theater of the Blue Ridge, the townspeople were merely ghosts. I wasn't just a man carrying a heavy sack of groceries for a shunned woman. I was reclaiming my own soul from the suffocating silence of my past. I looked up at the jagged peaks, those eternal sentinels of stone. They didn't care about the hard financial years or the failing banks in the north. They didn't care about the old sickness or the whispers that called her the leper's daughter. The mountains only respected the strength of the roots and the endurance of the heart. As I walked beside Elena, I felt my own roots sinking into the rocky soil. I was anchoring myself to a purpose I was only beginning to name. I would not let her face this world of beautiful lies alone. Not today, not as long as there was breath in my lungs. The next morning broke with a cold that felt like a physical assault. The frost had turned the valley into a landscape of broken glass. It clung to the dead grass like a shroud of lace, fragile and deceptive. I found Elena in the dirt yard behind her small, weathered cabin. A massive cast-iron cauldron sat atop a stone pit fire. The flames licked at the belly of the iron, orange and hungry. She was hacking at a block of rendered beef tallow with a rusted cleaver. Her knuckles were white, her skin chapped red by the biting wind. Her breath came out in short, frantic white puffs of effort. She didn't look up when my boots crunched on the frozen ground. "This is a woman's work, Thomas," she said, her voice raspy and thin. "The town says I'm not much of a man anyway," I replied, stepping closer. I reached out and took the cleaver from her trembling hand. Our fingers brushed for a fleeting second. It was a brief spark of human warmth against the freezing iron. I began to slice the fat into smaller, uniform chunks. She watched me for a long moment, her eyes narrowed in a quiet appraisal. I could see the exhaustion etched into the fine lines around her mouth. Then she turned to the wooden buckets of wood ash she had been leaching for days. The lye was a dark amber liquid, dangerous and biting in its purity. She poured it into the pot with a hand that didn't waver. The fire beneath the cauldron began to roar as the fat began to melt. The smell hit me like a blow to the chest. It was the heavy, cloying scent of rendered death mixed with the acrid sting of alkali. It burned the back of my throat and made my eyes overflow with involuntary tears. "Stir it," she commanded, handing me a long, heavy wooden paddle. "If it settles, it ruins, and we lose everything we've saved." I took the paddle and began the slow, rhythmic labor of the boil. The mixture was thick, like pulling a spoon through wet, heavy clay. The heat from the fire lashed out at my shins, a fierce contrast to the freezing wind. Steam billowed up in thick, white ghosts, wrapping around us like a curtain. The world beyond the fence line simply ceased to exist in that haze. There was no town, no gossip, no war-torn history left in the mist. It was just us and the bubbling, golden liquid of our survival. Elena stood opposite me, her face flushed a deep crimson from the heat. A single bead of sweat rolled down her temple, carving a path through the soot on her skin. "My mother used to say soap making was like a second chance at life," she whispered. She wasn't looking at me, but at the swirling heart of the cauldron. "You take the scraps of something dead and the ashes of something burnt. You boil them in the fire until they become something that cleanses the world." I looked at the mixture, watching the transformation take place. The tallow was no longer recognizable as the waste of a slaughterhouse. The lye was no longer just caustic water that could blind a man. They were becoming something new, something pure. "My mother died when the harvest was still rotting in the field," I said. The words surprised me, spilling out into the steam before I could stop them. The rhythm of the paddle had loosened a knot in my chest I hadn't known was there. The house felt like a grave for 3 long, silent years. My father didn't speak a single word until the first frost of '74. I felt the crushing weight of that old silence returning for a moment. It was a different kind of rot than what had taken her father's body. It was a slow, agonizing decay of the human spirit. Elena stopped feeding the fire and leaned against the rim of the cauldron. Her shadow was long and jagged against the cabin wall. "My father's hands were the first thing the sickness took," she said softly. "He was a carpenter who loved the feel of seasoned white oak. When he couldn't feel the grain of the wood anymore, he stopped looking at the sun." She reached out, her hand hovering near mine on the worn wooden paddle. "I spent 4 years watching a man I loved disappear while he stood right in front of me. The town thinks I'm tainted because I held his hand while he died. But the only thing that actually stayed with me was the loneliness." The paddle grew heavier as the soap began to trace. The liquid was thickening into a pale, creamy custard that resisted every move. My shoulders ached with a dull, throbbing fire that mirrored the pit below. Elena reached over to help me with the final, agonizing turns. She placed her hands directly over mine on the scorched wooden handle. Her skin was rough and map-lined with the history of her labor, but it was incredibly soft in the small places where the lye hadn't reached. The contact was electric, a grounding wire in a world of storms. It wasn't the frantic, shallow heat of a young man's lust. It was the profound weight of 2 people holding onto a raft in the middle of a gale. I could feel the steady pulse in her palms against the back of my hands. I could feel the slight tremor in her grip, the sign of a strength pushed to its limit. We stirred together, our bodies swaying in a slow, primitive dance of necessity. The steam rose up, hot and wet, sealing us into a private sanctuary. The smell of the soap had changed as the chemical marriage completed. The sharpness of the lye had been neutralized by the oil. It now smelled of something clean, something honest, something hopeful. "You don't have to be here, Thomas," she said, her voice barely a breath. "The fire is hot enough to burn every bridge you have back to that town. I looked at her through the shifting veil of white, really seeing her for the first time. I saw the courage it took to stand in the ruins of a life and keep washing. The bridge was already rotten, Elena, I said firmly. I'd rather stay on this side of the river and build something that lasts. She didn't pull her hands away from mine. Instead, she tightened her grip until our knuckles were pressed together. We stood there for a long time, the fire dying down to a bed of glowing rubies. The soap was ready to be poured into the hand-carved wooden molds. But neither of us wanted to let go of the paddle or the moment. The silence between us wasn't like the cold, suffocating silence of the store. It wasn't a wall designed to keep the world out. It was a bridge designed to let someone else in. We had shared the things that the town wanted to bury in the mud. We had put our grief, our loss, and our shame into the pot and let it boil. The sun began to dip behind the jagged, blue peaks of the ridge. The sky turned the deep, painful color of a bruised plum. We eventually poured the thick, warm liquid into the frames. Neither of us hurried to leave the fire. We stood quietly beside the cooling molds. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt earned for the first time. The future seemed like something we could build instead of merely survive. It would take days to harden into the bars that would wash away the grime of the world. As we cleaned the heavy tools in the gathering dark, the air felt different. The cold didn't bite as hard against my skin. The shadows didn't seem as deep or as threatening as they once had. I realized then that we weren't just making soap to sell for a few coins. We were scouring the shame from our own tired bones. Every man in town had only seen the leper's daughter, a girl to be avoided. I saw a woman who possessed the alchemy to turn ash into silver. Every woman in town had seen a stubborn fool who didn't know his place. I saw a man who had finally found a reason to stand his ground. Justice wasn't found in the ledgers of the men who ruled the valley. It was found in the dignity of a shared task and the warmth of a steady hand. She was the truth in a land that had forgotten how to speak it. As the moon began its ascent over the ridge, I knew I wasn't just helping a neighbor. I was building a home in the one place the town could never reach. We walked toward the cabin door, our shadows merging into one on the frost-covered earth. The path ahead was steep and covered in thorns, but for the first time in my life, the weight I carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. We had survived the boil. Now, we would wait for the hardening. And when the spring came, we would be the cleanest things this valley had ever seen. She saw a man who wasn't afraid of the fire. I walked her to her door. The smell of wood smoke clung to our clothes like a badge of honor. She reached out and touched my cheek. Her thumb grazed the line of my jaw. "Thank you for the help, Thomas. I'll see you at first light," I replied. I turned and walked back toward my own dark mountain. My heart was a heavy, steady drum in my chest. I knew the storm was coming. The pressure in the air changed. The animals went quiet. The silence was a physical weight. I looked back at the small glow of her window. I wasn't afraid. We had made something that could survive the winter. We had found a way to be clean in a world that loved the dirt. The sky didn't turn gray. It turned white. The Great White Hurricane of 1888 didn't arrive with a warning. When spring finally returned, the snow melted. The scars it left behind did not. Life slowly found its way back into the valley. So did we. It arrived with a hammer blow. By noon, the Blue Ridge Mountains had vanished behind a curtain of horizontal ice. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in a single hour. This was the historic monster that would freeze the Atlantic harbors. It would bury New York City in drifts 10 feet high, but here, in the isolated hollows. It was a lonely executioner. The wind was no longer a sound. It was a living, screaming thing. It howled through the eaves of my cabin like a wounded beast. I looked at the woodpile near my hearth. It was enough to keep me alive for a week. But Elena's cabin sat on the windward slope. Her father had been too weak to cut hardwood for years before his death. She had been burning pine and dry brush. Pine burns fast. It leaves a room like a tomb by midnight. I knew she was freezing. I could feel the chill in my own marrow just imagining her alone. A man's dignity is not measured by the clothes he wears. It is measured by the promises he keeps when the world turns cruel. I pulled on my heaviest wool coat. I wrapped strips of burlap around my boots. I tied them tight with twine. I filled a canvas bag with the last of my dry rations. A slab of salt pork, 2 pounds of coffee, a small sack of flour. I hoisted a bundle of seasoned oak onto my shoulder. The weight was a grounding force against the gale. I stepped out the door and the world ceased to exist. The snow wasn't falling. It was exploding. It hit my eyes like shards of broken glass. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The air was a thick, frozen soup. I followed the fence line by touch alone. The wire was a frozen thread leading me into a white void. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps. The air felt like it was made of needles. 10 minutes into the trek, the numbness began its slow crawl. It started in my toes. Then it moved up my shins like a rising tide of iron. I stumbled over a drift that reached my waist. The oak bundle shifted. It dug into the nerves of my neck. I didn't stop. Courage is the decision that someone else matters more than your own skin. I thought about the fire we had built together. I used that memory like a single glowing coal in my pocket. I kept it close to my heart to keep the blood moving. The trail to our house was gone. The landmarks were buried under 4 feet of rolling white waves. I moved by instinct. I moved by the pull of the earth. My fingers lost all sensation. They were just stiff, wooden hooks. They gripped the rope of the wood bundle with a dead man's strength. I fell once. The snow swallowed me whole. It was quiet beneath the surface. It was peaceful. The cold whispered that I should just stay. It told me the sleep would be warm and endless. I saw my mother's face in the dark of my closed eyelids. She wasn't smiling. She was pointing toward the ridge. She was the one who taught me that justice isn't a law in a book. Justice is the act of refusing to let a good soul perish in the dark. I clawed my way back to the surface. I spat ice. My lungs felt like they were filling with crushed glass. Every step was a prayer. Every heartbeat was an act of defiance against the storm. I saw a faint, ghostly yellow smudge through the haze. It was a flickering star in a dead universe. It was her window. I reached the gate. I couldn't feel the latch with my deadened hands. I threw my entire weight against the wood. The hinges groaned and gave way. The final 20 yards felt like a journey across a continent. The wind tried to push me back into the dark. It wanted me to fail. It wanted to prove the town right. They said I was just a fool chasing a shadow. I reached the porch steps on my hands and knees. My legs were no longer mine. They were pillars of salt. I hauled the wood onto the boards. The sound was a dull, heavy thud. I reached for the door handle. My hand wouldn't close. I pounded my shoulder against the heavy oak door. Once, twice. The world began to tilt on its axis. The white was turning to a thick, heavy black. The cold had finally reached the very center of me. I felt the door crack open. A sliver of golden light spilled onto the frozen snow. I saw a pair of boots. I heard a scream that sounded like it was miles away. I let go of the sack. I let go of the wood. I let go of the world. I hit the floorboards with a heavy, hollow sound. The last thing I felt wasn't the ice. It was the touch of a calloused, trembling hand on my frozen brow. It was the smell of wood smoke and old, sun-dried quilts. I had made it to the other side of the river. The world returned to me in fragments. A flickering orange glow on a rough timber ceiling. The smell of cedar smoke, the scent of something bitter, like steeped willow bark. The wind was still there. It sounded distant. It was a muffled beast pacing outside the walls. I tried to lift my hand to my face. It wouldn't move. My arm was pinned under a weight so heavy and soft, it felt like a fallen cloud. I blinked. My eyelids dragged against the heat of my own skin. The fever was a thick, rhythmic pulse behind my eyes. I shifted my head slightly. The pillow beneath me smelled of sun-dried grass. It smelled of the lye soap we had made. Elena was there. She wasn't sleeping. She sat in a ladder-back chair pulled close to the hearth. A single tallow candle burned on the small table. In her lap lay a sea of fabric. It spilled over her knees and onto the floor. She was leaning forward. Her eyes were narrowed in the dim light. Her hand moved with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Up, down. The silver flash of a needle caught the firelight. The soft shick of thread pulling through heavy cotton. She noticed my movement and froze. She set the sewing aside and she was at my side in a single, fluid motion. Her hand was cool against my burning forehead. Don't try to speak. Thomas. Her voice was a rasp of relief. You've been in the fever for 2 days. I looked at her hands. They were red and raw from the cold. She had dragged me inside alone. She had hauled that oak I brought into the house. She had kept the fire alive while the world outside turned to glass. The wood, I managed to whisper. My throat felt like it was lined with embers. It's burning, she said. She brushed a stray lock of hair from my eyes. You brought enough to see us through the worst. The bag, the coffee saved my spirit. She smiled. It was a small, broken smile that reached her tired eyes. And the salt pork is in the stew. I looked back at the chair where she had been sitting. The fabric was a quilt. It was a log cabin pattern. The center squares were all deep, vibrant red. In the language of the frontier, that red square meant the hearth. It meant the heart of the home. She had been sewing my story into those scraps of cloth. She had been stitching our survival together. I realized then that bravery isn't always a man in a storm. Sometimes bravery is a woman sitting in the dark. It is the steady hand that refuses to let the fire go out. It is the patience to wait for a heart to stop shaking. You almost died, she whispered. Her hand moved down to grip mine. Her fingers were strong. They were the fingers of a woman who knew how to hold on to what mattered. I couldn't leave you, I said. The words were simple. They were the only truth I had left. The town, they wouldn't have come for you. I know, she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a quiet, devastating dignity. They think the cold is a judgment from God. They're wrong, I said. I tried to sit up, but the world spun. She caught me. She held my shoulders against her chest. I could hear her heart beating. It was the same rhythm as the storm. Steady, unyielding, beautiful. The cold is just the world being the world, I whispered. The heat is what we make. She leaned her forehead against mine. I could smell the winter on her skin. I could feel the life in her. I thought I had lost you when you hit the floor, she confessed. Her voice broke. A single tear escaped and landed on my cheek. It felt like a drop of liquid silver. I dragged you to the bed and I prayed. I haven't prayed since my mother died. But I told God that if he took you, he'd have to take me too. That was the justice of the heart. It was a pact signed in the middle of a blizzard. It was more sacred than any sermon I'd ever heard in the valley. I looked into her eyes. I saw the reflection of the fire. I saw the man I wanted to be. I wasn't the outcast anymore. I wasn't the boy who ran from the shadows. I was the hearth. I was the red square in the center of her quilt. The wind gave a final, desperate shove against the door. The timber groaned, "Sa." The latch held. The world outside was a graveyard of ice. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of cedar and hope. She reached for a bowl of broth on the hearth. She began to feed me, one small spoonful at a time. It was a humble act. It was a communion of the broken. Every swallow brought the warmth back to my limbs. Every look she gave me mended a hole in my soul. We were two people the world had tried to discard. We were the scraps left over from the cutting table. But she was sewing us into something whole. She was making a masterpiece out of the remnants. I realized that honor isn't something given by a community. It is something forged in the lonely places. Thus, it is found in the weight of oak logs. It is found in the sting of a needle. It is found in the decision to stay when the easy thing is to let go. Sleep now, she whispered. She pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin. The weight of it was a promise. I'll be here when the sun finds the mountain. I closed my eyes. I didn't dream of the ice. I dreamed of the spring. I dreamed of a valley where the truth was as common as the grass. I dreamed of her hand in mine, walking through the tall timber. The great white hurricane raged on. The mountains were buried. The rivers were frozen solid. But in a small cabin on a windward slope, the fire stayed lit. We were the only warm things left in a dying world. And that was enough. That was more than enough. The fever broke like a dam in the middle of the night. I woke up with skin that was cool to the touch. My mind was as clear as a mountain spring in April. The storm outside had finally run out of breath. The great white hurricane of 1888 was leaving its permanent scars on the land. I could hear the eaves of the cabin groaning under the weight of the massive drifts. The log cabin quilt still held me in its embrace. I looked toward the stone mantel. The light of the morning sun was gray and weak, but it caught the dark glass on the shelf. 4 dark blue bottles stood in a neat, soldierly row. They were new. They had not been there when the first flakes of snow began to fall. I knew exactly what they were: quinine and laudanum, costly medicine that helped reduce fever and ease unbearable pain. In these isolated mountains, such things are more precious than gold. They were not bought with a few eggs or a pile of kindling. They required hard silver coin. They required a sacrifice that left a mark. Elena was standing at the iron stove. Her back was turned to me, so she was wearing her Sunday dress. The black wool was worn thin at the elbows but perfectly clean. The high lace collar was pinned tight against her throat. It was the dress she wore for funeral and for the rare days she went to town. It was the dress she wore when she wanted to remember she was still a lady. But something was terribly wrong with the silhouette. For as long as I had known her, a silver brooch lived at the center of that collar. It was a delicate piece of craftsmanship. It was shaped like a wild mountain rose. Her mother had carried it across the Atlantic in a small wooden trunk. It had survived the hard financial years. It had survived the long, lean years of the drought. It was the only piece of jewelry she had ever owned. It was the only piece of her mother she had left in this world. The silver was gone. In its place was a small, ragged hole in the white lace. The fabric was torn where the heavy pin had once sat. She moved to the table with a bowl of hot broth. Her hand went instinctively to her throat. Her fingers brushed the empty, ragged space. It was the habit of a woman who had lost her anchor. She caught me looking at the hole. She dropped her hand quickly and smoothed her apron. "You look like a man who has returned from the dead," she said quietly. The rasp in her voice had vanished. Only a profound weariness remained. "I feel like one," I replied. I did not ask her about the silver rose. I did not need to ask. I knew the exact price of my life. It was sitting in those 4 blue bottles on the mantel. She had traded her family history for my uncertain future. She had sold the only beautiful thing she owned to keep a dying man breathing. The broth was warm and smelled of salt and herbs. The steam rose in the cold, thin air of the kitchen. I realized then that justice is not found in the law books of the valley. It is not found in the iron scales of the judges in the distant city. True justice is a woman selling her mother's silver to save a man the world had forgotten. It is the raw courage to stay when the wind wants to tear you down. It is the quiet dignity of a ragged hole in a lace collar. I reached out from under the quilt and took her hand. Her skin was cold from the morning air. I squeezed it with all the strength I had left. I wanted to give her back the warmth she had given me. She did not pull her hand away this time. For the first time in our long acquaintance, she let the mask slip. Her eyes filled with a sudden, shimmering moisture. A single tear escaped her lash. It traced a slow path through the dust on her cheek. "The rose is gone, Thomas," she whispered. It was the first time she had ever admitted a loss to me. "I know," I said. My voice was thick with a debt I could never hope to pay. "But the garden is still here. We will plant something new when the snow melts." She nodded slowly. She leaned her forehead against mine. The storm was finally over. The world was buried in 10 feet of white silence. But inside this cabin, the red center of the quilt was still burning bright. We were the remnants of a hard world. We were the pieces left over after the cutting was done. But we were being sewn into something whole and strong, something that the winter could never break, something that would last long after the silver had been forgotten by the town. The sun finally broke through the heavy clouds. It hit the frozen window pane with a sudden flash. It turned the jagged ice into 1,000 diamonds. I looked at the blue bottles. I looked at the hole in her collar. I looked at the woman who had sacrificed everything for a promise. I knew that as long as I lived, I would spend every day trying to be worthy of that empty space. Yet somehow, I no longer saw loss when I thought about it. I saw a promise. One day, when the land healed and our work finally bore fruit, I would place another silver rose on her collar. Not because it could replace the old one, because she deserved to smile again. But a different kind of beauty had taken its place in the room. The beauty of a love that did not ask for a return. The beauty of a hand that held on when the rest of the world let go. We sat there in the quiet of the morning. The broth grew cold on the table. The fire burned low in the hearth. But for the first time in many years, I was not afraid of the coming night. I had seen the light in the center of the quilt. I had seen the soul of the woman who made it. That was enough. That was everything. The needle lay still on the table. The thread was anchored deep. The pattern was complete. We were no longer alone. Home was never the cabin. It was never the fields. It was never the deed locked inside a bank. Home was the quiet certainty that whatever tomorrow demanded of us, we would answer it together. We were the hearth. Spring arrived quietly. The snow disappeared from the mountain trails. Life began asking something new of us. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of things unsaid. The silence was no longer a void. It was a bridge. 2 days later, the fever finally broke its hold. My strength returned in small, treacherous increments. I felt the pull of the world outside the cabin walls. I needed to move. I needed to breathe air that didn't smell of sickness and sage. The snow had begun its slow, ugly retreat. It turned to a gray, slushy mud along the main trail into town. The sky was the color of a bruised plum. I had a borrowed lantern to return to the general store. It was a small excuse to face the town. It was a way to prove I was still a man of my word. I walked with a cane carved from a hickory branch. Every step felt like a negotiation with the earth. The town of Ellensburg was only a skeletal remnant of its former self. Years of financial hardship had left their mark here. Men stood on street corners with hollow eyes. They were ghosts of the silver mines. Their pockets were lined with nothing but lint and bitter memories. As I passed the blacksmith shop, the sun broke through a cloud. It was a sharp, cold light. It caught something in a window across the street. It was Miller's Pawn and Trade. The sign above the door creaked in the wind like a hanging man. It was a place where dreams went to gather dust and regrets. I stopped in front of the glass. The display was a graveyard of family legacies. There were tarnished medals from the Great Rebellion. There were wedding bands worn thin by years of hard labor. Then I saw it. Resting on a bed of stained red velvet was the wild mountain rose. The silver was darkened by the humid air of the shop. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. I could almost see the artisan's hammer marks on the delicate petals. It sat between a rusted pocket watch and a pair of broken spectacles. The price tag was tied to the pin with a piece of dirty twine. The numbers were written in a jagged, uncaring hand. $4.50, the exact price of 4 bottles of city medicine. My heart felt like it had been cinched with a cold leather strap. The realization hit me harder than the blizzard ever had. She hadn't just saved my life, she had liquidated her soul. She had traded her history for my future. She had walked through the freezing slush while I was lost in a fever dream of red hearths. She had stood in that dim, smelling shop. She had handed over her last treasure to a man who saw only metal and weight. She had sacrificed the only thing that tied her to her mother. I looked at my own hands. They were thin and pale. They were the hands of a man who had been carried. The shame was a physical heat in my chest. In the late 19th century, a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide. He was supposed to be the shield. He was the one who bore the cost of survival. Instead, I had become a burden. I was the reason she was now truly untethered in the world. That brooch was more than jewelry. It was the echo of her mother's voice. It was the proof that she belonged to someone, somewhere. It was her dignity in a town that looked at her with suspicion. I wanted to break the glass. I wanted to reach in and reclaim that silver flower. I wanted to run back to the mountain and pin it to her collar. But my pockets were as empty as the sky after a winter storm. The gold standard didn't care about a woman's love. The world only cared about the debt. I turned away from the window. The long walk home felt like a climb up a vertical cliff. The mud pulled at my boots with a greedy, sucking sound. The wind felt sharper now. It was a judge's gavel against my face. When I reached the clearing, the smell of pine smoke greeted me. It was the scent of home, but I felt like an intruder. Elena was outside by the well. She was hauling a bucket of water. The rope creaked. Her shoulders were set against the cold. Her movements were rhythmic and certain. She was a woman built of iron and grace. She looked up as I approached. She saw the way my chest was heaving. "You went too far for your first day out. Thomas," she said. Her voice was soft, but it held a sharp edge of concern. She wiped her damp hands on her heavy wool apron. Then, it happened, so it was a habit she couldn't break. Her fingers strayed toward her collar. They moved to the place where the rose should have been. They found nothing but the empty, frayed lace. Her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She simply dropped her hand back to her side. In that moment, I felt a resolve harden inside me. It wasn't a loud or violent feeling. It was a quiet, steady fire. It was the kind of heat that forges steel. I realized that gratitude is a debt that can never be fully repaid with words. Words are cheap in a world of hunger. Honesty and love have to be lived. They have to be earned through the soil. They are paid for in the sweat of the seasons to come. I walked over to her. I didn't ask for permission. I took the heavy bucket from her hand. She looked surprised, her brow furrowed in the fading light. "I can manage. Thomas, you're still weak." "I know you can," I said. My voice was steadier than my legs. "But you've carried enough for both of us for a while." She didn't argue. She didn't try to reclaim the weight. She just let go of the handle. We stood there as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks. The mountain turned a deep, bruised purple. Without the brooch, she looked smaller. She looked like a girl lost in the woods. But her eyes remained the same. They were the eyes of a pioneer. They were the eyes of a woman who would burn the world down to keep a single candle lit. I carried the water inside and set it by the hearth. The fire was dancing against the walls. I looked at the log cabin quilt draped over the chair. I looked at the empty blue bottles on the mantel. I didn't tell her I'd been to Miller's. I didn't tell her I had seen her sacrifice under a price tag. Some truths are too sacred to be spoken of in the light. To mention it would be to acknowledge her poverty. She was a woman who hated pity more than she hated the cold. She possessed a fierce, mountain-born dignity. Instead, I made a silent vow to the shadows in the corner. I would see that silver rose back on her collar. Even if it took every harvest I had left in my body, even if I had to work the dangerous timber camps in the north, even if I had to haul stones until my bones cracked like dry wood, justice wasn't something you waited for. Justice was something you built with your bare hands. We sat down to eat as the night deepened. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound. It felt like the heartbeat of the house. Every second was a gift she had purchased with her mother's silver. I reached across the table. The wood was scarred and old. I placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold from the well water. She looked up, startled. We didn't speak. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say I was sorry for being the reason her collar was bare. I just held her hand. I held it until the warmth of the fire filled the room. I held it until her fingers stopped trembling. The silver rose was trapped in a glass case in town. But the heart that had given it away was right here. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. True love isn't about what you keep in your pockets. It's about what you are willing to let go of so the other person can stay. It is the ultimate act of courage, to stand naked before the world so another can be warm. We were bound now by more than just a storm. We were bound by a debt of silver and a promise of gold. I looked into the fire. I saw the reflection of the man I needed to become. The mountain stood silent outside, watching us like an ancient god. The winter was far from over. The stores were low, but the house felt warmer than it ever had before. The next morning was Sunday. The air was a crisp, biting blue. The church bell tolled across the valley. It was a lonely, metallic sound. It summoned the righteous and the desperate alike. The air inside the sanctuary smelled of damp wool and old hymnals. It smelled of judgment and wood smoke. Elena walked beside me with her head held high. She wore her Sunday dress. The fabric was stiff and smelled of lavender. The lace collar looked lonely. It looked like a garden without a flower. As we stepped into the aisle, the murmuring stopped. It was a sudden, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm. We walked toward the back pews, every head turned. It was like a field of wheat bending in a dark wind. These were people who had known us our whole lives. Yet, they looked at us as if we were strangers from a foreign land. We sat down on the hard oak bench. The wood felt unforgiving against my back. I could feel the heat of 100 stares. They were cold. They were suspicious. In a small town, a man and a woman alone in a cabin was a scandal, even if a blizzard was the jailer, even if death was the alternative. Reverend Miller stood behind the heavy pulpit. He was a man who saw the world in black and white. He did not open his Bible. He did not call for a song of praise. He looked directly at our row. His eyes were like pieces of cold flint. He adjusted his spectacles. "There are those among us who walk a path of shadow," he began. His voice boomed. It echoed off the high rafters. "They bring the memory of uncleanness into the presence of the Lord." He spoke of unseemly associations. He spoke of a man losing his way for the sake of a tainted woman. The word tainted hung in the air like a foul mist. I felt Elena stiffen beside me. She didn't look down. She didn't hide her face. She stared straight ahead at the plain wooden cross. Her dignity was a shield. But I could feel her hand tightening on her skirt. I looked at the Reverend. I looked at the men in the front pews who nodded at his words. These were the men who had refused to help when the snow came. These were the men who had stayed by their own fires while she struggled alone. They valued their silver more than their neighbors. They valued their reputations more than a human life. I thought of the empty space on Elena's collar. I thought of the pawn shop window. A surge of righteous anger rose in my throat. It was a fire that burned away the last of my sickness. Dignity is not something granted by a man in a black robe. It is not something that can be taken away by a whisper. It is a flame kept alive in the dark. It is the courage to do what is right when the world demands what is easy. I stood up. The floorboards groaned under my weight. The Reverend stopped speaking. The silence was now absolute. I reached out and took Elena's hand. I pulled her gently to her feet beside me. I didn't care about the scandal. I didn't care about the taint. I looked at the congregation. I saw their fear. I saw their smallness. "She saved a life," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room. "She gave everything she had so that a stranger could live." I looked at the Reverend. "If that is shadow, then I want no part of your light." We turned together. We walked down the long aisle. Our footsteps were the only sound in the house of God. We walked out into the cold, honest air. The town did not forgive us that morning. It would not forgive us the next morning either. But we stopped waiting for its permission. We simply kept walking. The silver rose was gone. Winter eventually loosened its grip. The snow disappeared. The memory of her sacrifice never did. But as we stepped into the sunlight, I realized we had found something much more precious. We had found the truth. We had found each other. And in the middle of a dying town, we were finally alive. The mountain loomed over us, ancient and wise. It didn't judge, it simply endured. And so would we. The years continued to pass. Good seasons came and went. Then another hard season found us. The sky above the mountains had turned into a sheet of hot, polished tint. Several years passed before another terrible drought settled over Virginia. It had not rained since the last snow melted into the red clay. The spring that should have brought life brought only a parched, choking silence. I stood in the center of my cornfield. I kicked the earth with my boot. It didn't crumble. It shattered like old bone. The stalks were stunted. They were yellowed at the edges. They hadn't even reached my knees. I looked toward the horizon. I prayed for a single dark cloud, but the horizon was as empty as my pockets. On the kitchen table sat a letter. It was from the bank in Lynchburg. The ink was cold. The words were precise. It spoke of interest. It spoke of arrears. It spoke of the finality of the law. The winter storm had already killed 3 of my best cows. The drought was finishing what the frost had started. I sat on the porch and put my head in my hands. I was a man of the soil, but the soil was turning its back on me. I thought of the coal mines in West Virginia. I had heard stories of the dark shafts. I had heard of the soot that never left your lungs. I had heard of the men who went down and never came back up. But the mines paid in hard coin every Saturday. Hard coin could save the deed to this mountain. Hard coin could keep the bank away from Elena. I began to pack a canvas bag. The lantern light was dim. I moved quietly. I hoped the floorboards wouldn't betray me. I packed a spare shirt. I packed a tin cup. I packed the small Bible my mother had given me. I felt like a thief in my own house. I was going to leave a note on the table. I was going to tell her I would send every cent. I was going to tell her to wait for me. But as I reached for the door handle, a shadow moved. Elena was sitting in the rocking chair. Her face was half hidden by the dark. She didn't ask where I was going. She didn't need to. The mines are a graveyard for living men. Thomas, she said. Her voice was steady, but it had a jagged edge of fear. I'm not going there to die, Elena, I replied. I couldn't look her in the eye. I'm going there so we can keep this house. What is a house if the man who built it is coughing up coal dust in a shanty town? She asked. I gripped the strap of my bag. My knuckles went white. The bank doesn't care about my lungs, I said. They care about the paper. If I don't go, we lose the ridge. We lose the graves of my father and his father. She stood up slowly. She walked into the circle of lantern light. She looked older than her years. The drought had etched lines around her eyes, but her gaze was as sharp as a diamond. My mother sold her silver rose to buy medicine for a stranger, she said. She didn't do it to save a piece of land. She did it because people matter more than things. You are my person, Thomas. I felt the weight of the bag in my hand. It felt like a lead weight. I can't just sit here and watch you starve, I whispered. I can't watch the dust take everything we worked for. She stepped closer. She placed her hand over mine on the strap of the bag. Her touch was warm. It was the only warm thing in the room. We will find another way, she said. We will hunt. We will forage. We will bleed the stones if we have to. But you will not go into that hole. I looked at the letter from Lynchburg. It felt like a death warrant. They'll come for the house in October, I said. Then let them come, she replied. They can take the wood. They can take the stone. But they can't take us if we are together. I looked at her face. I saw the strength that had terrified the townspeople. It was a raw, unyielding courage. It was the kind of love that didn't ask for permission. I dropped the bag. The thud was the sound of a choice being made. I pulled her into my arms. I held her as if she were the only thing keeping me on the earth. The scent of her hair was like dried lavender and wood smoke. It was the smell of home. I'm scared, Elena, I confessed into her shoulder. I know, she whispered. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what's right while your knees are shaking. Outside, the wind picked up. It rattled the window panes. It carried the scent of the dying corn. But inside, the lantern flickered with a stubborn light. We sat together on the floor. We didn't need the chairs, we didn't need the table. We just needed the floorboards under us. The mountains have seen worse than this, she said. They saw the Great Fire. They saw the wars. They are still here, and we are still here. I realized then that she was right. Dignity wasn't found in a bank ledger. It wasn't found in a house or a field. It was found in the refusal to be broken. It was found in the hand that held yours when the world turned cold. I reached out and touched her cheek. I won't leave you, I promised. Never. She smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was more beautiful than any sunrise I had ever seen. We stayed there until the lantern ran out of oil. We stayed there in the dark. We listened to the mountain breathing. It was a heavy, ancient sound. It was the sound of endurance. The drought would continue. The bank would send more letters. The town would continue to whisper, but we had something they couldn't touch. We had a truth that didn't require a pulpit. We had a love that had been forged in the fire, and as the first light of dawn touched the ridge, I knew. The war was just beginning. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a ghost. I was fighting for the living. I was fighting for her. And that was enough. The Blue Ridge stood watch. It didn't judge. It didn't offer a miracle. It simply remained on. And so would we. The harvest would be hard. The rocks would be many. But we would swing the scythe together, every day, every hour, until the rain finally returned to the red clay of Virginia. We stopped measuring life by what we had lost. We started measuring it by what we still chose to protect. Every sunrise became another quiet decision to remain. Every sunset became proof that love had carried us one more day, until the silver rose of our lives bloomed again. In the heart of the drought, we found our wellspring, we found our mercy, we found our home. The first frost of October didn't just touch the window panes, it claimed them. A delicate, jagged lace of ice crawled across the glass, obscuring the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge. Inside, the kitchen felt like the only warm place left in a world turning cold. I sat across from Elena, my lungs still burning from the sharp mountain air. The harvest was in, the corn was shucked, and the root cellar was packed with what little the parched earth had surrendered. We were survivors of a season that had broken men much stronger than me. Between us sat a wicker basket, its weave frayed and gray. It was filled with the only inheritance we had left: scraps of cloth, tattered remnants of the people we used to be before the drought turned the soil to ash. Elena reached into the pile with hands that no longer looked like a young woman's. Her knuckles were swollen from the well crank. Her palms were mapped with the pale lines of healed blisters. She pulled out a length of ivory silk, so thin it was almost translucent. The candlelight caught the sheen of it, making it glow like a dying star. "My mother's wedding gown," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I remembered the story she had told me once about the day it was worn, a day of lace and fine china in a Richmond that no longer existed. Before the breadlines, before the bank notices were nailed to every door in the county. She didn't hesitate. She picked up the heavy iron shears. The sound of the metal meeting was a sharp, clinical snap. The silk didn't tear, it surrendered. She cut the fine fabric into perfect, unyielding squares. "We can't eat memories, Thomas," she said, looking me directly in the eye. "And we can't wrap ourselves in ghosts when the blizzard hits." There was a fierce dignity in her movements. She wasn't destroying her past. She was repurposing it for our survival. I reached into the basket and found a piece of blue-checked cotton. The color was faded to the shade of a summer sky just before dusk. I ran my thumb over the frayed edges. This was the handkerchief I had carried for years. The one I had handed to her behind the barn when her father had shouted at her for a spilled pail of milk. I hadn't had the words then. I was a boy with nothing but a patch of rocky land and a heart full of unspoken promises. I had watched her dry her eyes with this very cloth. Now, it was just another square in the mosaic of our lives. "You were so quiet that day," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "I thought you were judging me for my clumsiness." I shook my head. I was wondering how a man could ever be worthy of a woman who cried over a cow's hunger instead of her own. She handed me a needle. It was a small thing, a sliver of steel, but it felt as heavy as a plowshare in my calloused hand. She guided my fingers. "Small stitches, Thomas, close together. The wind searches for the gaps. It looks for the places where we are weak." We began to sew. The rhythm of the work was a prayer. In and out, push and pull. We were joining the silk of her gentility to the denim of my labor. We were stitching together the fragments of a broken decade. History remembers years like this through numbers, but families remember them through sacrifice. The newspapers in the city talk about the stock market and the falling price of wheat. They talk about the Red Cross distributing bags of flour stamped with "not for resale," but they don't know about the justice of the needle. They don't understand the courage it takes to cut up your only beautiful thing to make a blanket. We heard a heavy thud on the porch. A branch, or perhaps just the weight of the night. I tensed, my hand moving toward the shotgun leaning against the cupboard. Elena didn't blink. She just kept sewing. "It's just the mountain, Thomas. The mountain is restless because it knows we aren't leaving." She was right. The land had tried to starve us. The banks had tried to shame us. The local sheriff had come by 3 days ago with a look of pity that felt like a slap in the face. He had offered us a way out. A job in the textile mills down in the valley, a life of gray dust and ticking clocks. I had looked at the calluses on my hands and the fire in Elena's eyes. I had told him no. Dignity isn't found in a paycheck from a man who doesn't know your name. It's found in the soil you refuse to abandon. It's found in the way you hold your head when your pockets are empty. I picked up a square of heavy gray wool. It was from the coat I had worn to my father's funeral. It smelled of old cedar and the damp earth of the churchyard. I placed it next to a scrap of Elena's yellow apron. The contrast was startling. Sorrow and sunlight, side by side. My mother always said a quilt is a map, Elena said softly. Every square is a crossroads. Every knot is a decision. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in a bit of tissue. When she opened it, the light caught a small, silver locket. My heart stopped. It was the only thing she had left from her grandmother. Elena, no, we aren't that desperate yet. She looked at me with a gaze that was harder than the frost. I didn't sell it. Thomas. I took the chain and traded it for the medicine you needed last winter. I kept the locket so I could sew it into the batting, right in the center, over the place where our hearts will be when we sleep. I felt a lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. The sacrifice of women is the silent engine of the world. They give up their heirlooms and their dreams in bits and pieces. They do it so quietly that men often forget to notice. I took her hand in mine. The skin was rough, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever touched. I don't deserve you, I whispered. She squeezed my fingers. You stayed when everyone else packed their Fords and headed for California. You chose the rocks and the drought because they were our rocks and our drought. That is the only thing a woman ever truly needs from a man. The room grew colder as the fire died down. The embers glowed like the eyes of a hungry wolf in the hearth. We worked until our eyes ached. The quilt grew across our laps, a heavy, multicolored shield. It was a record of our endurance. There were pieces of the feed sacks we had bleached to use as towels. There were strips of the curtains from the nursery we had prepared 2 years ago. The nursery that remained empty after the fever swept through the county. We didn't talk about that square, we just stitched it more tightly than the others. That was the justice of our lives. The world didn't owe us a child, but it couldn't take away the love we had prepared for one. We sewed that love into the wool instead. Outside, the wind began to howl, a mournful sound that echoed down the chimney. It sounded like the voices of 1,000 failed farmers. But inside the kitchen, there was a different sound, the steady, rhythmic pull of thread through fabric. It was the sound of a fortress being built. We weren't just making a blanket. We were reclaiming our humanity from the wreckage of the Great Depression. Do you hear that? Elena asked, tilting her head. Hear what? The silence. The mountain has stopped trying to scare us. I looked at the quilt. It was a messy, beautiful, scarred thing, just like us. It was a testament to the fact that we were still here. The banks could take the house. The drought could take the crops. But they couldn't take the way we cared for each other in the dark. I realized then that true wealth isn't measured in grain or gold. It's measured in the thickness of the thread you use to hold your life together. It's the refusal to be torn apart by a world that values nothing. Tomorrow, the sun will rise on a white world, I said, and we will be warm. Elena stood up and folded the unfinished quilt over the back of the chair. She leaned over and blew out the candle. The smoke rose in a thin, silver ribbon. In the darkness, I could still see the outline of her shoulders. She stood tall, unbowed by the weight of the year. I followed her to the bedroom, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Each creak was a familiar note in the song of our home. We had built this life out of grit and silence. We had survived the hunger and the heat. And as I lay down beside her, I knew the winter didn't stand a chance. We were the architects of our own salvation. We were the keepers of the fire. The dirt beneath my fingernails felt like a badge of honor. The ache in my back felt like a victory. We had faced the darkest years of the Depression, and we hadn't blinked. We had turned our rags into a tapestry. We had turned our grief into a shield. And as the first snowflakes began to hiss against the chimney, I fell asleep. I didn't dream of the drought. I didn't dream of the dust. I dreamed of the silver rose blooming in the heart of the frost. I dreamed of a woman who could turn a wedding gown into a fortress. And I knew that as long as we had the needle and the thread, we would never be broken. The world could go on with its wars and its markets. We had our mountain, we had our quilt, and we had the courage to stay. That was more than enough. That was everything. We learned to rotate the crops. We nourished the soil with more than just hope. Elena had mapped out the drainage ditches. She worked with the precision of a scholar. I had dug them with the strength of a man who refused to fail again. The mountain seemed to reward our persistence. The rains came when we needed them. The sun lingered just long enough to sweeten the kernels. When the harvest finally began, the wagons didn't just rattle, they groaned under the weight of our success. I watched Elena in the field. Her back was straight, her movements were fluid. She wasn't just surviving the labor anymore, she was mastering it. The grain merchant in town stared at the quality of our yield. He didn't see a woman who had once been an outcast. He didn't see a man who had nearly died in a ditch. He saw the finest crop in the county. He counted the money into my palm. The coins were heavy and cool. The bills were crisp. This was the first time in years I felt the weight of security. I didn't take the wagon back to the farm immediately. I walked toward the part of town where the shadows were long. This was where the windows were filled with regrets. The pawn shop smelled of dust and old iron. I scanned the glass cases. My heart hammered against my ribs. There it was. The silver filigree of the brooch sparkled beneath a layer of neglect. It was the silver she had traded for my life when the fever took me. It was the sacrifice she never mentioned. It was the grief I never forgot. I laid the bills on the counter. The shopkeeper reached for the key. His eyes were narrow and curious. I took the brooch. I tucked it into my vest. I felt its cold edges through the fabric. It felt like a heartbeat returning home. I rode back to the farm as the sun began to dip behind the Blue Ridge peaks. The sky was a bruised tapestry of orange and deep violet. I found Elena standing beneath the ancient oak tree. The tree had seen 100 harvests. She was looking out over the empty fields. The stubble of the corn glowed in the twilight. She heard my boots on the dry grass and turned. The wind caught a stray lock of her hair. "The barns are full. Thomas," she said softly, "we did it." I walked up to her. The silence of the evening wrapped around us like a cloak. "We did more than fill the barns, Elena," I replied. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the small velvet pouch. Her eyes widened. "Bah." I drew the silver brooch into the light. The sunset hit the polished metal. It danced with a sudden, brilliant fire. She let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. "You went back for it," she whispered. "I never truly let it leave this house," I said. I stepped closer. The scent of dried hay and pine needles surrounded us. My hands were steady now. I pinned the silver onto the lapel of her work coat. The delicate metal looked out of place against the rough wool. Yet it looked exactly where it belonged. It was a badge of honor. She touched the brooch with her fingertips. Her skin trembled slightly. All of the struggle had led to this moment under the oak. The harvest wasn't just in the grain. It was in the way she looked at me now. There was no more fear in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. Her voice was thick with emotion. "It's a debt paid," I answered. "But the interest I owe you will take a lifetime to settle." She leaned her forehead against mine. The world outside our fence line didn't matter. We were the living. The silver on her chest was a promise kept. I put my arms around her. I felt the solid strength of the woman I loved. The harvest was over. Our life was just beginning to bloom. The air in Ellensburg had changed its weight. Success is a difficult thing to argue with. The townspeople no longer looked through a ghost. They looked at her with a cautious, simmering curiosity. Our wagons had been the heaviest at the grain elevator. Our horses were the sleekest in the stable. But it wasn't the money that made them stare. It was the way Elena moved through the dusty streets. She walked with quiet authority. She had looked into the eyes of death and did not blink. I watched them from the seat of our buckboard. The same porch where men used to spit tobacco was now silent. Thomas Winnick stood by the hitching post. His hands were deep in his pockets. His farm was being swallowed by debt. He looked at Elena. His eyes drifted to the silver brooch. He once thought she read too many books to be a farmer's wife. Now, he watched her discuss seed prices with precision. He saw a woman who had learned to use the frost. There was a shadow of bitterness in his expression. It wasn't anger. It was the realization of what he had lost. Ezra Denor stepped out of his father's shop. He adjusted his silk vest. He tried to look like a prosperous merchant, but his gaze lingered on Elena's hand on my arm. He had once told her she was too plain-spoken. Now, her honesty was the thing the county respected. She didn't play social games. Yeah, she didn't need to. Her worth was written in the rows of corn. I felt a surge of quiet, fierce pride. I didn't feel the need to gloat. Their regret was a louder message than any words. We stopped at the post office to pick up the weekly paper. The headlines were filled with news of the New Deal. President Roosevelt was talking about recovery on the radio. People were desperate for a sign that the Great Depression was breaking. They looked at us as if we were that sign. We weren't just farmers who survived the drought. We were the evidence that the earth still had a heart. As we climbed back onto the wagon, a young girl approached. She couldn't have been more than 10. Her dress was made of flour sacks, clean but frayed. She looked at Elena's brooch with wide, hungry eyes. "Is it real silver, ma'am?" she asked. Elena knelt down on the dusty boards of the wagon. She didn't look down at the girl. She looked into her. "It is more than silver, child," Elena said. She reached out and took the girl's small, rough hand. "It is a reminder that what you give away in love always finds its way back." The girl nodded as if she understood a secret language. Elena reached into her basket and handed the girl a jar of our blackberry preserves. "Tell your mother that the mountain is sharing its sweetness this year." The girl ran off, clutching the jar like a treasure. I realized then that Elena wasn't just my wife. She was becoming the soul of this place. It was found in the silence of the people who once turned their backs. It was found in the way the sun hit that silver brooch. We drove home as the first evening stars began to pierce the blue. The road was bumpy. The air was cooling fast. I reached over and took her hand. Her fingers were calloused. They were strong. They were the hands that had pulled me from the brink. "Are you tired?" I asked. She shook her head. "I feel like I could walk across the entire range tonight." We passed the old cemetery on the hill. The headstones were leaning in the tall grass. I thought about the people who hadn't made it through. Years later, I thought about the families who had packed their lives into old trucks and headed west. They were looking for a miracle in California. We had found our miracle in the dirt. It took more than rain to make things grow. It took a willingness to be broken and rebuilt. We reached our gate. The house stood tall against the darkening sky. The windows reflected the last of the light. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a fortress. I unhitched the horses in the barn. The smell of fresh hay was thick and sweet. It was the smell of safety. I walked into the kitchen. Elena was lighting the kerosene lamp. The yellow glow filled the room. She had already set 2 plates on the table. There was fresh bread and a bowl of stew. It was simple. It was everything. We ate in a comfortable silence. The shadows danced on the walls. "I heard a man in town today," I said. She looked up. "He said the government is going to start paying people to plant trees." "A windbreak," she said, "to stop the dust from moving the earth." She nodded slowly. "We should do it. We should plant a wall of pines on the North Ridge. To protect the soil for the ones who come after us," I asked. "To protect the soil because it is the right thing to do," she corrected. That was Elena. She didn't just think about the next season. She thought about the next century. She believed in the dignity of the land. She believed that if you treat the earth with respect, it becomes your kin. After dinner, we sat on the porch. I pulled out my pipe. The smoke drifted into the cool night air. Elena sat in the rocker next to me. She was wearing a shawl over her shoulders. The silver brooch pinned her shawl together. "Thomas," she said after a long while. "Yes. Do you remember the night the frost almost took the garden?" "I remember," I said. "I remember you stayed out there until dawn." "I wasn't just fighting for the vegetables," she whispered. "I know. I was fighting for the idea of us." She looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountain. "I thought if the frost won, then the town was right, that I was cursed." I stood up and moved behind her. I placed my hands on her shoulders. "You were never cursed, Elena. You were just tested. Is there a difference? The difference is in the ending," I said. I leaned down and kissed the top of her head. The world was still in the grip of a hard era. The banks were still failing in the cities. The hunger was still real in the valleys. But on this porch, there was a peace that money couldn't buy. It was the piece of people who had looked at the abyss and decided to build a bridge over it. It was the piece of a man who knew his wife's worth. It was the piece of a woman who knew she was finally seen. The crickets began their rhythmic song in the grass. The mountain loomed above us, ancient and watchful. It had seen the rise and fall of many. It had seen the greed of the timber lords. It had seen the desperation of the coal miners. But tonight, it felt like it was smiling on us. We had stayed, we had fought, and we had won our dignity back, one furrow at a time. The silver brooch wasn't just jewelry. It was a shield against the past. It was a promise for the future. As we went inside and closed the store, I knew one thing for certain. The winter could come now. Let the wind howl. Let the snow pile high against the glass. We were ready. We were the architects of our own salvation. We were the keepers of the flame, and we would never be broken again. Those men looked at Elena and saw only a burden. They saw the daughter of a dying man. They saw the keeper of a cursed, crumbling house. They saw the ash on her skin and the soot in her hair. They were fools. They did not understand the chemistry of a human soul. Pressure and heat do not always destroy. If the material is pure, they forge something unbreakable. I saw the diamond while it was still buried in the Appalachian coal. I felt its sharp, brilliant edges when everyone else feared the dust. Elena stopped at the edge of the wooden boardwalk. She looked out toward the jagged peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She did not look at the men who had rejected her. She was not seeking their validation. She did not want their hollow apologies. Her world was bigger than their small-minded judgments. Her spirit had outgrown the narrow streets of Ellensburg. "Are you ready, Thomas?" she asked. Her voice was clear. It was steady like a mountain stream. "I've been ready since the day you stood on my porch," I replied. We climbed back onto the wagon. The old wood creaked under our weight. I took the reins in my calloused hands. As we pulled away, I glanced back one last time. The bachelors of Ellensburg were still standing there. They were frozen in the amber light of the late afternoon. They looked like statues of a past that no longer belonged to us. They were men who chose safety over depth. They chose a quiet, stagnant life over a meaningful, difficult one. The dust from our wheels settled over their polished boots. I knew they would spend their remaining winters in regret. They would wonder about the fire they let slip through their fingers. Love isn't just about finding someone who fits your world. It's about finding the one brave enough to build a new one with you. I reached over and took Elena's hand. Her skin was rough from labor. It was warm against mine. She was the rarest thing in the state of Virginia. I was the only man smart enough to know it. The years did not just pass. They marched. They brought the financial panic that swept through the region. They brought the Great War that took the boys from the valley. They brought the seasons of drought where the earth cracked like broken glass. But we held. The fire in the hearth now pops and crackles with a steady, rhythmic heat. The smell of burning cedar fills the room. It is sweet. It is sharp. It is the scent of home, outside. The Blue Ridge Mountains are draped in a heavy, silent blanket of snow. The same wind that once nearly broke me now only rattles the shutters. This house was built to last. I sit in my heavy oak chair. The wood has been smoothed by decades of my weight. My hands are gnarled now. The joints are stiff like old, twisted grapevine, but they are warm. Across from me, Elena sits in the rocker I made for her 40 winters ago. Her hair is no longer the dark of a raven's wing. It is the color of a winter sky just before dawn. It is a soft, shimmering silver. She is knitting a pair of small, woolen socks. Her needles move with a grace that has never faltered. Click, click, click. It is the heartbeat of our sanctuary. At our feet, 3 of our grandchildren are huddled on the log cabin quilt. The fabric is faded. The colors of old shirts and Sunday dresses have been softened by 1,000 washings. Every scrap of cloth in that quilt is a map of our survival. Little Sarah, the youngest, traces the patterns of the stitches. She has Elena's eyes. They are bright, they are piercing, they are full of a quiet, banked fire. "Tell us about the brooch again, Grandpa," she whispers. I look at Elena's chest. The silver brooch is pinned there. It catches the orange glow of the dying embers. It has been there every single day since that afternoon under the oak tree. I smile. I feel the familiar tug of a memory that refuses to grow old. That silver didn't just come from a shop, Sarah, I tell her. It came from a time when we had nothing but our word and the red dirt beneath our boots. Elena looks up from her knitting. A small, knowing smile touches her lips. She does not interrupt. She never does. She only watches the children. She makes sure they understand the weight of the story. I tell them about the courage it takes to be different. I tell them about a town that wanted everyone to be the same. I tell them that the greatest harvests aren't the ones you pull from the ground. They are the ones you grow in the hearts of the people you love. I look around this room. I see the sturdy walls. I see the family that fills the space. We didn't just build a farm. We built a fortress of dignity. The men of Ellensburg who once called me a fool are mostly gone now. Their rejections and their whispers are buried. They are under the same soil they tried to protect from us. But we are here. Our story is written in the lives of these children. It is written in the way Sarah holds a book. Her mind is hungry for worlds beyond the mountain. It is written in the way my son handles his plow. He treats the earth with a kindness I taught him during the lean years. Love is not a lightning strike. It is the slow, steady burning of a candle in a long, dark night. It is the willingness to stay when the storm is screaming at the door. It is the quiet act of selling a memory to save a life. It is the long, hard journey to buy that memory back. I reach out, I rest my hand on Elena's knee. Her skin is like ancient parchment. It is thin, it is delicate, but her grip is still as firm as a mountain root. We have finished the ledger of our lives. There are no more entries to be made of wounds. There are no more notes on rejections. There is only the peace of a life well lived. The fire burns low. The room turns into a world of shadows and gold. The children are beginning to nod off. Their heads rest against each other. This is the legacy of the fools who stayed. This is the reward for the woman who was too much for everyone else. She was exactly enough for the man who needed her. As the night deepens, I feel a profound sense of gratitude. Kindness is the only thing that truly lasts, and love is the only thing that makes the long winter bearable. I remember the winter of 1902. The frost was so deep the cattle died in the fields. We huddled under this very quilt. We shared a single piece of cornbread. I offered her the last bite. She pushed it back to me. "We eat together or we don't eat at all," she had said. That was the moment I knew we would never be defeated. Dignity isn't something given by a neighbor. It is something forged in the cold. It is the choice to keep your head high when the world wants you on your knees. I look at the brooch one more time. It isn't just jewelry. It is a testament to the fact that justice eventually finds its way home. It doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it comes with a warm house and a granddaughter's laugh. The log cabin quilt tucked around the children's legs was made from my old work shirts. Each square is a year of sweat. Each stitch is a promise kept. When the Great Depression hit the valley and the banks shuddered, we didn't panic. We had already learned how to live on faith and forest wood. We taught our children that a man's wealth is measured by the peace in his wife's eyes. By that standard, I am the richest man in the Blue Ridge. The clock on the mantel ticks. It marks the passing of a century we saw turn together. From the horse and wagon to the horseless carriage, from the oil lamp to the glowing bulb. But the fire in the hearth remains the same. The love in this room remains the same. Thank you for sitting on this porch with me through all these seasons. Thank you for remembering the silver brooch. Thank you for honoring the log cabin quilt. If you found a piece of your own heart in our story, please subscribe to the channel. Help us keep these memories alive for the next generation. In our next chapter, we will travel back to a different kind of silence. We will uncover the secret behind the never-sent letter of a Civil War soldier. It is a story of a different kind of devotion. It was hidden for decades in the lining of a tattered blue coat. It is a story of a promise that survived the smoke of Gettysburg. I hope to see you there, by the fire. That is where the truth always waits for those brave enough to listen. The snow continues to fall outside. It covers the tracks of the past. It leaves a clean, white page for tomorrow. Elena reaches out and covers my hand with hers. The silver of her ring matches the silver of her hair. It matches the silver of the brooch. a lifetime of silver, a lifetime of gold. Good night, my friends. May your own harvest be plenty. May your hearth always be warm, and may you find the courage to stay when the rest of the world runs away. Sleep well in the shadow of the mountain. The light will find us again in the morning. Until then, keep the flame, keep the faith, and never let the world tell you what you are worth. Only you and the ones who love you know the truth of that. Goodbye for now.